So when it comes to creative content, it can be a huge help when you want to reach global audiences, when you want to internationalize a club, for example. It means that a club who might be sitting in a league, a far-flung place perhaps, can still captivate and engage audiences the other side of the world, because good content travels. If you've got a wicked idea, it will travel. If you've got something brilliant at its heart that is perhaps using a player that is maybe doing a trick shot or is ultimately fun or new or novel, it will fly, it will travel. So the idea is everything. As long as there is a fantastic idea at the heart of the content, then it can travel. Creativity, it sounds a cliche, but it transcends borders, it travels, it flies. That's the very nature of kind of viral. It's not about trying to make one, but it's about trying to harness and understand what is good and what is right so that people grab it and share it and they get excited and elicit emotion as a consequence of consuming it. So if the idea is there, then it will go, and that means it can go all around the world in an instant. I think from a COPA90 perspective, there's been so much that we've been so proud and feel so humble that has travelled so well. You have kind of episodic series like Derby Days that are really predicated on human emotion. The football, of course, is the conduit. Football is, of course, a part of it, but really you're exploring what it is to be human in a city, in a town, in a country, in a place, which perhaps have divided loyalties, which sit both sides of the fence, which show an intensity around a rivalry, but it's always just predicated on human stories, a backdrop and a history and why it got to that place in the first place and what it is that's the feeling and why they support that wonderful club. You know, there's so much in our most recent Derby Days, I think it was season 4, where we explored Spanish football rivalry without barely ever mentioning the most obvious. But we were exploring places like the Balearic Derby, Atletico Baleares and Real Mallorca, and the football becomes just an aside because really you're talking about human stories. So these style stories connect everybody because we're all humans. We all understand what it is to feel that level of emotion or surprise or anguish or anxiety or anger or elation. And so a series like Derby Days can travel from Japan to Jakarta, wherever it might be in the world. It can travel, and again, it can transcend boundaries. And that's what brilliant storytelling can do. So when clubs are thinking about producing content for target markets, they just need to respect the nuance of the locale. They need to understand what it is to be a person in that location, not ever assuming exactly how you should be, exactly what you should say. I think some clubs, you take maybe Bayern Munich, I think they're doing it really in a really exciting fashion. The Bayern Munich, based out of New York, create fantastic content for the Americas region, for example, for a North American market, but it will be nuanced. It isn't exactly precisely the same as what is befitting for a German market, and that's always going to be true. That's always going to be right. It's really important that people understand those kind of different ways people want to consume, the different behaviors they're into. A lot of it comes down to need state, the feeling you might have while you're consuming the content. It might come down to platform. If you're in the Far East and watching something on WeChat, the chances are it might be a slightly different feeling as when you're having a more lean back 15-minute experience with a documentary on YouTube in the other part of the world. So as long as those kind of pillars are understood, then clubs obey them and they think about what those different need states are and how people think and feel in those countries or even in those cities, because it gets very, very regional, then the content can fly and then the content can have a great effect. So I think clubs do need to pay close attention when they are putting content in regions, in areas of the globe that might be the Far East or North America, for example. There is obviously a difference. But it isn't just those extremities either. There's a huge difference between perhaps a Spanish appetite and North America, or LATAM as a region and Japan. Like, there are many kind of cultural differences and nuances that need to kind of be obeyed and adhered to and sort of understood. At its heart, though, still needs to be the pillars that will actually be able to carry the message in the first place. Football travels. Football is the common denominator. Football is the language that everyone understands. So if you are showing maybe trick shots or fun play or 5-shot challenges or whatever that is, chances are that can transcend any of the language problems. When you go deeper than that and you're telling human stories, it's important you speak to the protagonists. If we created a documentary, as we did recently, about Japan qualifying or not for the World Cup, it was so important we were speaking to the right people who are deep in that culture, deep in that football culture and that psyche, going into ultra fan groups, to just supporters groups, to the fanatics who were so important to the kind of the message being conveyed in the right way, to ultimately at the heart of what was at that point Japanese football. Without doing that, with going in with just an assumptive kind of idea of what it should be like, then you will never fully get to the bottom of it. So it's really, really vital that you obey those local kind of nuances, that you go and dig a little bit deeper and find out the what really is the beating heart of these kind of cultures or these cities where the football is being played. So yeah, with COPA90 we do talk about football being a language. We genuinely believe it's the most accessible language on earth right now. It is almost cliche, but the best cliches are often, let's be honest, the most true. Nothing is such a great common denominator. Maybe music. Maybe it's music and football around the world that can connect people. You can be in the back of any taxi in the world and basically have a conversation about football, about an identity. I'll get into the back of a taxi in India and talk about Manchester United, and I may as well be in kind of Busby Way in Manchester, such is its brilliant connective tissue ability. It means we as a business are proud and excited that we can talk about really hard issues. We've talked about male suicide through the language of football, how footballers have suffered depression. We can uncover issues around mental health that you might struggle to convey otherwise without the language of football, but where our audience have thanked us openly because they can finally talk about issues around depression that they weren't previously able to chat about because COPA90 and football exist. Or we can do documentaries with Syrian ultra fans who are supporting their clubs in the context and backdrop of war. They require the weekly normality that football can afford them against such horrific kind of war-torn, awful sort of environment, but football is the thing that creates and retains a normality. We've done documentaries in northern France and held a football tournament for refugees who are quite literally have lost an identity, and football can give them that identity back. So football does so much. It speaks so loudly. And the more we can play on that and allow us to be celebratory and joyous, I feel like the world has never needed it more in that respect. So I think that's it can do us a great service over the coming years. I think sponsors have a brilliant part to play in the process and what is football and how we engage audiences. Listen, we're at a time where people question regular advertising in the ways that were always interruptive. They worry it's too wasteful in places that are perhaps now seen as old-fashioned, and COPA90 play in a place where we hopefully do a more modern way of communicating and leveraging and working with brands. Audiences are not allergic to brands. They expect a symbiotic relationship with brands and advertisers. They want to be given something. They want to see what that value exchange is transparently. They want to understand what the brand's going to give them. They want to know what that advertiser is kind of doing for them if they're buying into the brand. It's a very sophisticated, very mature relationship. So advertisers, sponsors, brands, they should get involved by augmenting a fan experience, being that additional layer into a fan's life that gives them something more, builds on what it is to be a fan of football, gives them that extra layer, that extra depth of involvement. When brands do that and don't just interrupt what they're doing, but become what they are interested in, then they're going to be in a brilliant position. I think we're seeing a brilliant, exciting time where the very smallest clubs are gaining the most fantastic exposure because of their creativity. Even big brands with money behind them, but not the biggest brand in Italy was Roma, but their brilliance within social, their prowess in that space has kind of get hugely elevated. There's a team in my beloved Ibiza at the moment, a tiny little club on a tiny little island, who are resonating hugely because they're taking a really smart, novel approach to their communications. They're learning from the likes of maybe COPA90, maybe #United, maybe understanding the new vernacular, for example, of football and the new grammar and of how you use football media. And it's helping them kind of catapult themselves forward. Look at the way Bristol City used comic kind of memes. They piggybacked on the whole meme culture. They did really ironic kind of use of their players, and they owned that whole space, creating social memes every time they celebrated a goal. Clubs can resonate far and wide if they've got a brilliant idea and they use social, because social will propagate in an instant if the idea is good enough. I think the perfect international content piece needs to be pure. It needs to retain the utmost simplicity. It needs to be seen and understood in an instant. You shouldn't have to fight to understand it. If it obeys the local nuances, if it is true to authenticity and legitimacy of where it is intended or what it is about, then as long as it is simple, as long as perhaps you involve human storytelling, then you will go a long way and it can travel far and wide.